In today's episode, we are going to be discussing the layout of Adobe After Effects and the fundamental tools and knowledge to get you started. So, where do we begin? To start a project, you need to click the New Project button. And now we are displayed with an empty project. Let's add a composition. Click the composition button, let's give it a name. In the Preset tab here, Adobe provides us with a bunch of settings such as 1080p, 24 frames, 4K 30 frames, 8K 23 frames, a bunch of preset displays. We can customize this ourselves, however, by dragging any of these little knobs. We can also change our frame rate to whatever we desire. We have 60 frames per second. However, let's put it back to 1080p at 30 frames per second. You can change the background color of your set, which is useful if you're creating overlays. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now we have our empty composition. Let's talk about all the sections and the layout of the display. So within the left section, we have something known as the Projects tab. Now this holds all of our elements within our project window. So let's add some elements real quick. Let me open up some images and drag them into Adobe After Effects. Let's get some JPEGs, a PNG, a video, and that's enough. I highly recommend you add all of your elements into your project window at the very beginning instead of later, as it could cause some issues importing your files and it can slow down your workflow. Now that we have our PNG, JPEG, and video file, you'll notice that we can drag it into our timeline. In the top left section of our screen, we have our basic tools. So we have our selection tool, which allows us to grab any layer. Let's add the video at the top. So with the selection tool, we can drag any layer and move it anywhere around our screen, even outside of the preview window. We have our hand tool, which allows us to drag our preview window. We have the zoom tool, which is equivalent to scrolling in and out on the mouse wheel. We have our rotation tool, which allows us to rotate specific layers. We have our anchor point tool, which allows us to change the anchor point and create like an offset. And now if we use the rotation tool, you'll notice it's rotating around that anchor point. Let's set that back to center. You have your shape drawing tool. Now if you hold left click on it, you can change to specific shapes. Let's go Eclipse. Let's unclick from our layer and just drag. On the where it says fill, we can change the color. We can also go to stroke and give it an outline color. We can change the width of the stroke. We can give it more specific, such as no stroke. Give it a gradient. And you can do the same for fill. So let's turn gradient off on the stroke. Next is the pen tool. Now what can the pen tool do? Well, you can do the same as the shape tool, however be more specific with your design and shapes. You can hold left click and drag to add curves. And the main use of the pen tool is to create masks, which we will get to in a little bit. We got our text tool, which allows us to draw a text box and type whatever we like in it. We've got our paintbrush tool, clone tool, and eraser tool. These are for freehand. You can also use the rotoscope tool and the puppet tool. These are more designed for specific effects that you can create, such as giving inanimate objects some life in a scene by adding anchor points, and these anchor points allow you to animate and move that specific point of an image you have in your scene. It's for a specific effect. So that's the top left section. So now we have our top right section. Our top right section contains custom windows that Adobe After Effects provides to users, such as the effects window, which will only make the effect tools visible. However, I recommend sticking to default and learning your way around the default display. If you don't like a specific section, you can drag it to any location you like, such as I don't like this project window being here. I want it on the right side. I want it up top. You can make it custom. If you delete any of these windows by accident, you can click the window button, go to workspace, and you can click reset default to save layout, and then click default again. You can also choose what you see on your display. At the very top right, you have a search window. And this search window means you can type anything, let's say effects blur. It will open up your default browser, bring you to Adobe site, and bring you some relevant articles about that topic. Under the search bar, you have half of the meat of the program, which contains your audio settings, your preview settings, your libraries, your paintbrush tool settings, your brushes, your content awareness, a tracker tool which is useful for a more specific effect down the line, which we'll get into in another video, your alignment of layers. Let's click on this and set it to centered, far left side of the screen, right side, top. You can get custom with this, however most of the time I would guess we would just drag it around with the selection tool. You got your effects bar, and within this effects bar you have all of the stock Adobe effects and custom plugins if you have any, and you can click down on the drop down menu and drag them onto your scene. So that's the right side of the screen. Let's talk about the very center of the screen. The center is called the preview window. Now let's talk about the settings of the preview window. We first start with our magnification tool. This allows us to zoom in really close and specific, such as 800%, 50%, 1.5%. It depends what you're looking for. However, fit up to 100% is the best setting, as it changes as you're changing the size of your layout. On the right is your preview timeline. Now, if you're moving on the timeline, you'll notice that this number is going up. Think of it as just a clock of where the scene is at. Next to that, we have our snapshot tool, and then next to that is our show snapshots. This is good if you want to capture a specific frame and look at them. Further to the right, you have your show RGB channel, and this show RGB channel allows us to see various specifics such as the data of reds, greens, blues, the data of our colors. Let's leave it on full RGB. Now we have our resolution. So let's zoom in up and close, and you'll notice it's very pixelated. If we click this and go to full, you'll notice it's a lot more clearer. This is because this is the full resolution of the layer. Let's turn that back to half, and there's a reason why. So as you're editing on the fly, it has to render in real time to display through the preview window what's happening. And this takes a lot of computer power, and it can stutter and slow down your workflow. So if you have it on full, it will be a lot slower experience. However, if you have it on half or third, it will be a lot smoother and crispier performance at the expense of losing quality. But this doesn't mean your final product's going to be looking at this quality, as when you export, you can choose all the settings and render it at the resolution you have of your composition. To the right of that, we have our transparency grid. So this is especially useful if you are creating an overlay. So let's put this in the center, and let's click the transparency grid. You'll notice now it's transparent, there's no background, and our animation is just working on an empty field. This is good if you have like a text on the bottom left of the screen that says someone's name, like a news report, Bobby, boy, and so on. That's what this button does. It shows what's transparent of your scene. Next to that, you have your 3D cameras. This is more advanced. We'll get into that in a future tutorial. You got also the viewing points of the different cameras. You have your exposure dial, which you can change the exposure up and down, and we have our exposure reset button. Now we're getting into the most important section of the layout, which is known as the timeline. So what is the timeline, and what does it do? The timeline displays where each layer is placed in time, and it also allows you to add specific effects and keyframes to them layers. So where do we begin? Let's talk about the left side. At the top left, we have, similar to the preview window, a nice little timer which tells us how far in time we have gone, so 2 seconds. If we hold Control and click, you can be more specific with frames. So we're 62 frames down. However, let's just leave it in seconds. Under that, we have our Layers tab. This hosts all of our layers, aka our images, our shapes we've drawn. At the top, we have a search bar, which allows us to search specific layers. This is useful when you have a lot of layers within your scene, which is going to be quite common down the line. You have all of these tools creating drafting 3D, hide all layers which are shy. You can add motion blur to your layers. You can also get a graph editor, which we'll get into when we discuss keyframes. On the right side, we have this bar with numbers. So what does this mean? Well, these bars indicate how long a layer is alive for. So let's drag the shape layer down to less than a second. You'll notice when we pass it, it disappears. Above that, there's a green bar, and that defines what has been rendered. So, as there's not much going on in the scene, it will instant render. But as you get more, it will be slower, and you'll see blue turning into green to show you the progress of render. Above that, we have these bars here. This allows us to zoom in and out. This allows us to see only a specific margin and have it on repeat. So repeat after 2 seconds. Let's add it a little longer so you can see that it resets. And that's basically the design of the timeline bar. Let's get into how to use the fundamental tools. Now that we understand the layout and what some of the tools do, let's understand the fundamentals and how we can use these tools to our advantage. So, I created these circles and big rectangles. And I've aligned it so the anchor points on each of these objects are in the center. And now that we've done that, let's discuss keyframing. Now, keyframing is basically how you animate. And how is this done? Well, let's grab our circle, which I've highlighted and named circle, and let's go click transform. Let's move the position of our circle out of frame with the y-axis. So now it is not visible, it's hiding up at the top. Let's click this little button here. What this does is it activates the keyframe for this specific variable. So we click it, it turns blue, and we clicked it at 0 seconds. So this is the starting position. Let's say we want the ball to fall and hit the ground within 2 seconds. So let's go to 2 seconds. Let's change that Y all the way to where we want it to stop when it hits 2 seconds. So now if we go back, we'll notice it is animated. And it is animated accordingly to the timeline. So let's say we wanted some more variation. We can hover over both our keyframes, click Keyframe Assistant and add an easy ease. This just makes it smoother. Or if we want to be creative with it, we can go to this graph editor. When we're in the graph editor, we can look at the speed vamp. So here it shows the speed in which the transition will occur. So it starts off slow, gradually gains, and then it slows down again at the end. What if we want it so it goes really fast at the beginning and then slows down at the end? Well, you click the beginning and then you can drag this little yellow to adjust where it's gonna go up and down. So we made it so now it's gonna go super fast and then slow down. That's how you change the speed of a keyframe. So let's go back to our normal editor view. And I kind of like this. But what if we want it to be a little longer? Well, we can just drag that keyframe out. So by the time it hits 6 seconds, it will hit the floor. So let's move that back. You can do many things with keyframes, such as we can even do the same thing for scaling. Let's set a keyframe at 0 seconds for scale, and we'll make it so the ball is tiny. I want it so when it's here to be at its max at 130, 148, and then by the time it hits the bottom, I want it to go back to its default of 100. There we go. That's the basics of keyframing. What else can we do? Well, you see this little icon here? This enables motion blur on this specific layer. So we want the ball to have some motion blur to it. So let's add motion blur. We click that little button, you'll notice it's symboled, and with this thing highlighted blue means our preview window will show us motion blur. It looks a lot better. But what if we don't want to actually use that type of motion blur? What if we want to add our own motion blur with our effects? Well, that's very easy to do as well. Go to your effects bar, which will be on the right side of your screen. Go to blur, and let's give it a Gaussian blur. Granted, this will blur the whole object. Now we can change the blurriness. So, for instance, we can make it extremely blurry, so it looks like an orb. Let's also give it a glow effect. Drag that onto the layer, and we can change it so the glow has color. Like that. You can change all of this, and you can change the threshold. Let's make it like, I like that. Glow radius, let's make it emit a lot. Okay, there we go. We've just added ourselves some glow and some blur to it ourselves. But what if we want the glow to only show up at a specific time? Well, it's the same principle. See on the left of all these variables, there's the same stopwatch. Let's say at 0 seconds we want the glow's threshold to be at 0%. And when it hits here, we want the threshold to be 100%. And by the time it hits where it stops, to around 43%. Let's take a look at that. Now we have animated our effects. Now let's ignore the circle. Let's take a look at these two rectangles. What we're going to be looking at is something called the pick whip tool. So firstly, let's take the red. Let's give itself a scaling keyframe. So at 0 seconds, I want it to then grow in size. Oh wait, hold up. You go to 100%, and then we don't forget to move the timeline along, or else you'll just be overlapping your keyframes. So at 1 second, I want it to go up, and at 2 seconds, I want it to go back down to 100. Oh, there's position, my bad. I want scale to go back down to 100. So let's take a look at that. It goes up and it goes down. So what can we do? Well, we can assign it as parent role or a child role. So let's say we want the blue to be paired with the red. As you can see, when the blue is the child of red, the blue will do everything the red's gonna do in its own position. So it will climb at the same time as well. Let's go back to red and let's give it a position. Set the keyframe perfect there, and by the time it gets here, I want it to go down and I want it to go to the right. And then when it gets back there, I want it to go back to the left and then goes back up. Now what does this look like? Well, it's going to increase together, move together, and it just follows its path. This is what the pick whip tool does. It makes it so you don't have to keyframe for another object and you can make it follow the exact same path. Now that we talked about keyframing and pick whips, let's take a look at masking. Now masking is extremely important when you have a lot of variables that you want to remove from, let's say, a green screen, and you want to compose them all together in like a big atmospheric shot. So let's remove all of these. We can even close that, and let's add our test image. We'll put the test image at the top, and you'll see it's just a tiger on a green screen. If you have the tiger on the green screen's image layer highlighted and you click the pen tool and you start drawing around on the image, you'll notice that it's highlighted in a different color than it would usually be, the outline. That's because you are creating a mask. So once I click here, you'll notice that everything outside of what I've highlighted will disappear. Now, what we can do is we can flip it with the invert button within the images layer and go to the mask section, and this is mask 1. You can have multiple masks on the same image, but we're just gonna mess with one for now. if we click this little button that says inverted, everything on the inside will be gone and everything on the outside will be present. You can switch between the two. And same thing with these settings next to it. So, what do we want to do with this mask and why is it useful? Well, there's a lot of wasted space there. And we don't really want that green. So, let's add something called a linear color key. This is the easy way to remove color from any image or video. It's not the best way, but it is a very easy alternative method of doing so. So once we have our linear color key in our effects control panel, we can click on the pipette tool next to the key color and click on the image of what color we want to remove. So I don't want the green. You'll notice it did a pretty decent job at the very beginning. Now we can change between all of these matching color effects, like do we want to adjust it based on hue? Do we want to change it based on chroma? So let's see what the difference is. Matching tolerance, let's increase that a bit, and you'll notice that it's starting to chip away at some of the detail really up close. So let's adjust softness. Oh, it doesn't look good if when you do that. So maybe RGB is not our way. Let's go to hue. Let's adjust hue a little bit. You'll notice that the detail on the arm is starting to get very ugly and removed. What if we soften it? Same thing. Softening really doesn't do too much. Chroma. Now chroma is another story when you go too detailed, but that's not too bad. What if we soften it a tiny bit? I'm happy with that for now. What did we just do? We removed the green background from our image, and it was inside of a mask. But what else can we do? Well, how can we make all these elements work together? Well, first, let's drag this down and let's set up an idea. So my idea for this piece is that I want to make it kind of like a 007 introduction, where there's a little circle that's going to move around the screen, highlight a specific thing, and then leave the screen. So let's try to do that. Let's go to new, solid. We can use any color, but should we use black? Nah, let's use red because it's easier to see. Let's put it on the top and let's go Eclipse tool because we want a circle. Highlight the red solid layer and let's draw our circle. So what we are doing is making a mask, similar to with the pen tool but with the shape tool. So I like the size of this. However, you'll notice that everything on the outside is see-throughable and everything on the inside is that red color. I don't want that, so let's invert the mask. That's perfect, that's what we wanted. So let's hold Alt and drag our circle out of frame. And let's go down in the mask 1 drop down. Let's add a keyframe in 0 seconds. Let's make it so when it hits 1 second, it's already here, highlighting the tail. At 2 seconds, I want it so it's already crossed its face. And at 3 seconds, I want it so it's left the screen. And at 4 seconds, I want it to come back. And that's perfect. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So as you can see, we have incorporated all of the elements besides the pickwood tool to make this simple, clean animation. We've got a mask. We got an inverted mask. We've got a linear color key on the tiger to remove the green. We've also got keyframes to animate where the circle will move. And the only thing we haven't included in this piece is the pick whip tool because there's no real need. Let's take a look at what happens if we add Gaussian blur to our mask. It just looks a little cleaner. But yeah, these are the fundamental tools that should get you started on making your first animations. Now here is the last fundamental that I'm going to be teaching you guys, and that is how to pre-compose. So, what is pre-composing? Well, it's sticking all of your elements within a scene. So for instance, I made this scene. It's a little janky. But it's just a small 3-ish second long animation. And when you have a big scene and a big project, you don't want a bunch of layers all in one big composition. So what you do is you'll do something called precomposition or precomposing. So what you do is you hover over all of your layers within your composition that you want to precompose together. You right click and click precompose. You can give it a name, so we can call this star and warp effect. And now as you'll see, we have a completely clean timeline, no layers anywhere besides this already set precomposition called star and warp. And if we play it, it's the exact same thing. And now we can start adding other elements into the scene, such as I said, another colored solid layer. We'll call it, just give it cyan color. We'll put it above it. We can start doing our own animations to it on top of that composition we just made. So let's set this to 0. Let's make it so when that lightning goes off, it goes there, and we'll have another keyframe at 0% here. When it goes here, I want it to be like 100% and then 0%. So now we're just adding to what we had, and it's a lot cleaner, so there's less clutter. However, if you do want to alter some elements within the previous composition you were doing, all you have to do is double click it. And now you can recustomize all of these effects. You can move the keyframes if you really want. You can give it an easy ease. You can change anything. It just makes it more organized and neat. And let's go to our full composition. But yeah, that's all for today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot. If you want to learn more, please make sure to follow the blog, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow all the socials, and prepare for more updates. So thank you guys so much for watching, and goodbye.